Welcome to this session. We are going to begin the study of the historical books of the Old Testament. This will include books from Joshua through Nehemiah. With an overview first of what the historical books are about. The historical books tell the story of Israel from the death of Moses, the emergence of Israel in the Promised Land, and through the Old Testament time period. So a considerable length of time from approximately 1280 BCE through 433 BCE. So quite a few years. Some important features that we should watch for as we're reading the historical books. We'll take a note that this is primarily a narrative or storytelling type of history. There are also songs, poems, and lists of kings and judges. And don't forget, there must always be genealogies to show the continuity of God's chosen people. So the Hebrew Bible is organized into three main sections. The Torah, or the teaching, also called the Pentateuch, or the 5 books of Moses. And that is what we have studied up to this point: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So now, then the next section in the Hebrew Bible is the Nevi'im, or the prophets. And third, the Ketuvim, or writings. It is often referred to as the Tanakh, a word combining the first letter from the names of each of the 3 main divisions in Hebrew writing, or Hebrew alphabet. Here's a picture of the Jewish Study Bible that I refer to and get a lot of my information from. It is really quite interesting introduction. And if you're reading the words of the Old Testament, they are very similar to our version of the Old Testament. And the stories have the same information in them. In the Christian Bible, however, the historical books are arranged to roughly tell a continuous story of Israel from 1280 BC through 433 BCE. In the traditional Jewish order of the Bible, the Chronicles are actually the very last book because it summarizes all of the Jewish scriptures. Whereas we put Chronicles in order after the books of Kings, we have the books of Chronicles. And then our prophets are later. These books include some source materials, connecting materials. And what that means is that the compilers of the text were using materials that were current at that time, and together with older source materials that they found and collected and put them together to stitch together a narrative in their own words. In other words, they were doing historical research and then combining it to create a narrative. In the Jewish tradition, the book of Joshua through the books of Kings are called the former prophets because of the prophets who speak within those narrative stories and books. The book of Deuteronomy is also included as part of the historical collection in the Jewish tradition because Moses is considered a prophet. In fact, he is considered the greatest prophet of all time. So this is the first part of the historical collection of books. This collection of books tells the story from the time of Mount Sinai through the destruction of Jerusalem in 587 BCE. And it narrates the history of the kings in both of the northern and southern kingdoms that are the result of a division of the lands in the Promised Land, a division of the tribes as well. The second part of the collection is Chronicles Ezra, and Nehemiah. And it begins with the genealogies all the way back to Adam. This narrative starts with both kingdoms, the northern and southern, but completes by following only the southern kingdom of Judah. And that being said, there are two remaining historical books, the books of Ruth and Esther. And this little video is about 12 minutes long, and the purpose of showing this video is for you to just see how we've figured out, how scholars have figured out that the Old Testament books were put together. I find it quite interesting. It's in 3 sections. Maybe we don't always agree with all the theology behind it, but we at least can look at this video and appreciate the attempt of the scholars to organize things into a manner where it will be understandable for people.
If you open a Protestant Christian Bible and look at the table of contents, you'll notice the first 3 quarters is a collection called the Old Testament. If you look at the list of books, you'll see it's made up of 39 smaller works that are grouped into 4 main sections. The first 5 are called the Pentateuch, followed by the historical books, then the poetic books, and finally the books of the prophets. Now that seems simple enough, but actually it's more complicated and way more interesting. This arrangement of the books in a single volume called the Old Testament is a later Christian tradition that developed after Jesus and the apostles. In ancient Jewish tradition, these works were all on separate scrolls and were conceived of as a unified 3-part collection called Tanakh. It's a Hebrew acronym for Torah, which means instruction, Nevi'im, which means prophets, and Ketuvim, which means writings. The Tanakh has the same books as the Protestant Old Testament, but they're arranged differently. The Torah corresponds to the Pentateuch, but the prophets consist of 4 historical narrative books, and then the 15 works named after specific prophets. After this comes the writings, a diverse collection of poetic and narrative texts. Now this 3-part design is really, really old. It's referred to in ancient Jewish texts like the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Wisdom of Ben Sira, even Jesus of Nazareth mentioned it. And that's because this 3-part shape is woven into the compositional design of the scrolls themselves. If you pay attention, you'll discover that every scroll has been coordinated by means of cross-references that link each work into the larger 3-part collection. So, who put all these scrolls together? It was a long process. Some of the famous contributors are named, like Moses or David, but most of the authors remain anonymous. In the Bible, they're simply called scribes or the prophets. These scrolls took shape throughout Israel's history as generations of prophetic scribes collected earlier stories and poems, integrated them into larger compositions, and then eventually shaped all this material into the unified library of scrolls, the Tanakh. It's clear from texts in the Psalms and Prophets that these prophetic scribes believed that God's Spirit was guiding this whole process, so that through these human words, God speaks to his people. That's why they treasured these texts, studying and composing them into a unified collection. We don't know when precisely this process was finished, but it was somewhere in the last centuries before the time of Jesus. In its final shape, the Tanakh offers a prophetic interpretation of Israel's history that claims to reveal God's purposes to rescue the whole world. And while we can't do justice to the whole collection in one video, it's helpful to get an overview of what these scrolls are all about. The Torah begins with God creating and blessing a great piece of real estate, our very good world. And God entrusts it to a creature that reflects the divine image, human, or in Hebrew, Adam. God appoints humanity to rule the world as kings and queens of creation, and the question is whether they will trust God's wisdom to discern good and evil, or seize autonomy and define good and evil for themselves. But there's another creature with the humans, a mysterious snake. It's in rebellion against the Creator, and it dupes the humans to foolishly rebel against God's generosity. As a result, humanity is separated from its divine source of life and exiled from a garden of blessing to die in a dangerous wilderness. From there, humanity keeps spreading and redefining good and evil, and things go downhill fast. They build cities plagued by violence and oppression, all leading to the foundation of a city called Babylon, where people exalt themselves to the place of God. And now the basic plot conflict of the whole Bible is set. God wants to bless his world and rule it through humans. But now, humans are the problem. They're under the influence of evil, they're stupid and short-sighted, and headed for self-destruction. And this is all a setup for God's solution. We need a new kind of human. And so God promises that a new human will come, who won't give in to the snake. In fact, he'll crush it and be crushed by it. From here, the story traces the promised lineage to a man and a woman, Abraham and Sarah. God entrusts them with the same divine blessing given to humanity on page 1. And so they leave Babylon to a new garden-like land that God promises to give his family. What follows is the story of Abraham's family. 3 generations, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, followed by 12 sons. And our hopes are high until we read their very dysfunctional and destructive family story. They lie, cheat, nearly kill each other, not to mention the sex scandals. But what did you expect after the garden story? They're humans. Eventually, Abraham's family ends up exiled down in Egypt. All these failures of Abraham's family form a dark background for the handful of bright moments in the story. God stays committed to these people. He even makes them an eternal promise called a covenant, that he will rescue and bless all humanity through them. How exactly isn't clear, but Abraham's family is at its best when they stop their selfish scheming and trust God's promise with radical faith. From here, the family grows. They end up enslaved in Egypt, and we're introduced to the Torah's other main character, Moses. God raises him up to rescue the Israelites and bring them to a mountain where they're all invited into a covenant relationship with God. They're given 613 terms of the relationship, guidelines for becoming new kinds of humans who will faithfully represent God to the world. And Moses brokers this whole deal because he's awesome. He's the ultimate prophet who speaks God's word to Israel. He's a priest who represents them before God, and he's even called a king, Israel's leader and deliverer in time of need. But as the Torah progresses, the Israelites fail big time. They violate the covenant, and even Moses rebels against God. In fact, the Torah ends with Moses predicting that Israel's failure will continue as they go back into the Promised Land, and they're going to end up in exile once again. But he has hope that God will fulfill his promise to rescue Israel. One day he will cover for their failures. He'll heal their selfish hearts so they can truly love God and live. And then Moses dies. Now, the final sentences of the Torah scroll are surprising. They zoom forward in time, and we hear from the prophetic scribes who shaped the Tanakh. They reflect back on the story of Moses from their vantage point, and they tell us that never again in Israel's history did a prophet like Moses arise. Man, I wish another prophet, priest, king like him would come along. And with that, we move into the Nevi'im. It has 2 sub-collections. First, the former prophets, 4 narrative works about Israel's story in the Promised Land, told from the later perspective of the prophets. Things start great with Joshua's leadership. We're told he's successful because he's just like Moses, and he meditates on Scripture day and night. But eventually, even Joshua fails, beginning Israel's long and violent descent into self-destruction, just like Moses and the garden story anticipated. These stories mostly focus on the failure of Israel's kings, prophets, and priests, how they lie, cheat, and kill each other, and worship idols. It's basically a longer, bloodier replay of the ancestors' failures. But there are some bright spots. God reaffirms his covenant promise to bless humanity through a new human. It will be a king from the line of David. And you get some stories about people like David or Solomon who have moments like Abraham when they trust God, but it never lasts. And wouldn't you know it, the family of Abraham ends up right where they began, conquered and exiled in Babylon. But remember, this whole story is being told from the later perspective of the prophets, and they know exile isn't the end. So they designed these stories of Israel's past as pointers to their future hope. When God does rescue his people out of Babylon, he'll send that new king who will be like Moses and David and Solomon were on their good days. In fact, this is what the second part of the Nevi'im, the latter prophets, is all about. There are 3 large and 12 short works connected to specific prophets. And this design intentionally recalls the 3 plus 12 ancestors from Genesis, whose stories of failure contained the seeds of future hope. These prophetic scrolls are loaded with cross-references that link back into the narrative of the Torah and the prophets, and they carry the story further. The job of Israel's prophets was to be like Moses, to accuse the old Israel of failure and corruption, and to warn them about the looming result, the great day of the Lord, which ended with defeat and exile in Babylon. But the prophets also promised that God had a purpose, to purify his people and recreate a new Israel who would be faithful like Abraham was. They'll live in a new covenant relationship with God under the reign of that promised ruler, who's described as a new Moses, but called by the name David. He will be the one to restore God's blessing to the entire world. The conclusion of the Nevi'im is just like the Torah. There's a note from the Tanakh's prophetic scribes. They reflect back over the whole story so far, and they urge readers to anticipate the arrival of a new Moses-like prophet, who they call Elijah. He will announce the arrival of Israel's God to purify and save his people. From here we move into the Tanakh's third and final sub-collection, the Ketuvim, a diverse collection of scrolls. Each one has been designed to link back into the key themes from the Torah and the prophets and develop them further through an elaborate tapestry of cross-references. For example, the Psalms scroll is introduced by 2 poems that are coordinated to the beginning of the Torah and the prophets. In the first psalm, we meet the righteous one, who's described as a new Joshua, a successful leader who meditates on the scriptures. He's like the king promised by Moses, and he's like the eternal tree of life in the Garden of Eden. Psalm 2 then identifies this figure. It's the promised king, the Son of God from the line of David, who's going to defeat evil among the nations and restore God's blessing to the world. And the rest of the Psalm scroll teaches God's people how to pray as they wait for this future hope. Then there are the wisdom scrolls that address some of the most difficult questions raised by the story of the Torah and the prophets. So Proverbs sounds like Moses in the Torah. Trust in God, be faithful and obedient, and you'll have peace and success. But then Ecclesiastes and Job reflect back on Israel's complicated history and say, yeah, we tried that, and it's not that simple. These 3 books carry on a profound conversation about what it means to live wisely in God's good and often confusing world. 2 of the last books of the Tanakh to be written make a crucial contribution. The Daniel scroll looks back over the long history of Israel's failure and suffering as a strange door of hope into a new future for the world. One day, that new human promised in the Torah and prophets will arrive. He's going to be trampled by humanity's animal-like inclinations towards evil, but then God will vindicate him and raise him up to rule the world in divine power. And finally, the Scroll of Chronicles retells the entire story of the Tanakh, from the beginning up to Israel's return from exile. The author focuses on God's promise to David of a future king who will reunite God's people in a new Jerusalem and bring divine blessing to the nations. The final lines of the Chronicles scroll have been coordinated with key texts from all over the Tanakh. They keep alive the hope of an ultimate return from exile, pointing to the arrival of an Israelite whose God is with him, that he may go up and restore the new Jerusalem, and that's how the story ends. The Tanakh is a majestically and intentionally designed collection of ancient Hebrew scrolls. These diverse texts from all periods of Israel's history have been woven together as a unified story about God's covenant promise to Israel and to all humanity. They were made for a lifetime's worth of reading and reflection, as these remarkable human words offer a divine word of wisdom and future hope that still speaks today.
And that is a quick overview of how the Old Testament came to be. It's really very, very interesting, and especially since we realize now that the way the Old Testament was put together, or the Tanakh in the Jewish tradition, was from a point of view where you're looking back on history or back on events and trying to make sense of it and pull it together. So we keep that in mind as we read through, that there is deliberate editing going on and trying to make sense out of the stories. as we read them. And so that brings up the question, are these books really history? So the answer to that is going to be quite complex because history can be seen in a number of different ways. We have to realize too that we are often looking at history from our perspective of studying history through the Western modern world idea of what history is. It is different than writing history for a reason, as was done with the Tanakh. When we look at history, we can say, is it really something that happened? Is it an actual event from the past? Or we can look at history and say, well, we're just reading this history book, we're studying it, we pick out a certain event, maybe we do a little research on it, and that's our history. And then we can refer to an account of what happened in the past, based on reliable sources if possible. So there's a lot of ways of looking at what history is. But what type of history specifically is the Old Testament? The Old Testament book offers a narrative account of what happened in Israel's past, but with some qualifications. So think about the fact that there are people, scribes, prophets, who are putting this history together to tell a story. So it's a narrative account. So the books would not meet with modern standards for an account of history. The compilers of these books did not have access to the modern methods that we would have of inquiry or of authentication of events. Boy, that is a word. And so they didn't have all the same types of resources we have. And second of all, the writers were purposely writing theology into history. So they have a purpose and a reason for writing their stories. And the reason is theological. Some things that are agreed on by scholars are that a school of priests or groups of compilers work together to organize the stories into a coherent, theologically informed history. There are clues by references to materials that have been lost throughout the narrative, such as references to the Book of the Acts of Solomon, or the Book of Annals of the Kings of Israel, and the Book of Annals of the Kings of Judah. We will see some of these references in the books of Kings, but they have been lost through history. Although at the time of the compilers, they had access to it. Biblical narrative is different because it's combining theology and history together to teach lessons about God by reflecting on the history and by looking forward to the promises of the future. So biblical narrative assumes that God is active in the world and is at work in the present and is shaping the future of Israel. Biblical history is not trying to be objective about the past. The narrative is interested in describing history in order to teach lessons about God and to reflect on Israel, both past and present. So there's no purpose of being objective. We have lessons to learn from this, and that is the purpose of reading it and studying. And so the biblical narrative is unique in many ways, and to our Western way of thinking, sometimes pretty difficult and struggle with some of the ways things are written, because they don't kind of fall into the parameters that we are used to learning through school how to read something and how to interpret something. So we have a different mindset. So we have to always remember that this is written in an ancient time. It is written by people who are in a whole different cultural setting. So therefore, the way they see things and write things and put things together, their worldview is totally different than our modern Western worldview. So we need to cut them some slack. So some features are difficult to interpret, and here are suggestions of some that are difficult. Brevity. So the narrative is concise and every word counts. In the Hebrew language, when written, every word has a specific meaning and is chosen to reflect that meaning, as well as the overall sentence or phrase that it is included in. So that makes the narrative sometimes quite concise and at the same time quite dense as far as being able to understand it. And it's meant to show something. They're not worried about explaining what a character's action is or what that character thinks or feels or what that character's motives are. They're just showing something that happened or explaining something or in the narrative, but not worried about the character's feelings or motives. And there's a lot of symbolism, wordplay with names and puns, and irony and parody in the stories. There's repetition with slight differences. That made me remember how when the servant went to find a wife for Isaac way back in Genesis, how each time the servant told the story of why he was there and what his purpose was and how it came to be. To each different person that he spoke to, the story had the same meaning but had different nuances based on whom the listener or audience was. There are narrative gaps, leaving out some information for which the reader has to wonder what is there between the lines. There's juxtaposition, the placement of smaller and unrelated passages within a larger passage. Sometimes those develop the plot, but sometimes not. Sometimes you wonder how they even fit in to the story overall. So it makes you think. The all-knowing and reliable narrator. The reader is just to trust this narrator. We're not told how the narrator knows what the facts are or where their knowledge comes from, but we are just told that the narrator knows the realm of heaven and earth, and just to trust that. So the plot of a narrative always has a problem or a mystery that needs to be solved. In the historical books, the problem is that the failure of God's people to remain faithful. This plot develops into a cycle of unfaithfulness and then a return to faithfulness. It becomes a cycle of prosperity and destruction and eventually fall in exile. But that cycle always returns to a promise of hope and restoration for the future of Israel. So there are repeating themes throughout. There's sin, followed by judgment, by repentance, by deliverance, by a period of peace. Their leadership is important for the people in order to do well. God is faithful to his promises despite Israel's failures. God's word is always present through his servants and his prophets. And then remember from Genesis 12, the promise, there will be the promise of descendants, there will be the promise of a land, and there will always be struggle. So these are repeating themes throughout the Old Testament, and we've seen this happen quite a lot just through the Pentateuch And now when we go into the historical books, we'll see the themes repeating. Covenant is important. The hope for Israel is through covenant renewal. Upon reaching Mount Sinai, Moses renewed the covenant with the exiles from Egypt. Upon reaching the edge of the promised land, Moses again renewed the covenant with the desert generation. And Joshua renewed the covenant at the end of his life. The big question still remains, can Israel serve the Lord faithfully? So that's an introduction to the historical books and overview. In this last short little video, I want to show you, you will see some of the things that I talked about as far as language, as far as using language in particular. Listen to some of the ways there's a play on words described by the professor in this video. And we'll talk about whether there is really a conquest of the promised land or not as we go into the book of Joshua next week. So let's watch a short video here.
With this lecture, we move out of the Pentateuch, out of the Torah, and into the second division of the biblical canon. In Hebrew, the Nevi'im, the prophets. The first part of this corpus is known as the Deuteronomic history. And here we mean by Deuteronomic history, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. They're called the Deuteronomic history because they follow that same general rubric of the book of Deuteronomy. Kings who behave properly are described as being rewarded. Kings who behave improperly, which is most of them, are described as being punished by God. So the history here has an editorial gloss and ethos that springs from the concerns of the book of Deuteronomy. The history itself was probably not edited until well beyond the time of the Babylonian exile, after the 5th, maybe 4th, or even as late as the 3rd century BCE. So let's go back to the beginnings of the Deuteronomic history, the book of Joshua, and indeed, let's backtrack just a little bit more to the death of Moses, because in order for Joshua to take over, the reins of leadership must be passed on. As you already know from discussing the Mosaic Code, at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, we have a record of the death of Moses. But it does raise the question, why does Moses, after all the trouble he went through to get the people out of Egypt and to lead them through the wilderness for 40 years, why, when he's finally on the borders, is he not allowed to cross over? Which has always seemed very unfair to me. The Bible actually provides us an answer. I'm not really happy with the answer, but here's how it goes. According to Deuteronomy 31 and repeated in 32, Moses is forbidden to enter Canaan because he disobeyed a divine order. The Lord had told Moses, here I'm citing Numbers 20, command a rock to bring forth water. In other words, speak to the rock. But we're told Moses struck the rock instead with his staff. He was told to speak to it, he hit it. And the Lord says to Moses, because you did not trust in me to show my holiness before the Israelites, you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them. In other words, if Moses had spoken to the rock, it would have been a miracle. If he hit the rock, heaven knows, maybe he hit a fissure. God is upset. Moses was disobedient. The miracle was not as glorious. Some readers may well conclude that God's reason is petty. Others may find it perhaps fitting. There was no good reason to keep Moses out of the land, no good moral reason or ethical reason. But it may also be the case that Moses is like, say, Winston Churchill. During a particular period of a nation's history, you need a particular type of leader. And when the nation's historical setting changes, when you go from war to peace, or when you go from a community wandering into the desert, and into a community that has to conquer a new land by military might, new leaders are called for. Winston Churchill or Moses has done his job. And perhaps it's also appropriate that he remain outside the land in solidarity with the people he led for those 40 years, because as you know, only 2 who came out of Egypt will ultimately go into the land. I look at Moses as on the outside as if he's a guardian watching over. It's not a bad image. So at the end of Deuteronomy, Moses blesses the Israelites as a father would bless his children. And then we're told, the great leader dies, he is buried in Moab, and quote, no one knows his burial place until this day. Nor do they need to, in fact, because Moses' memorial is the Torah and those people who keep it. And this brings us to Joshua, the transfer of leadership, and the question of how the people enter the land. God had promised to the patriarchs, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that they would have land. Here is the fulfillment of that patriarchal promise. The covenant community will get a land flowing with milk and honey, but they have to fight for it. Oh, by the way, on milk and honey, since we just completed in the last lecture talking about dietary regulations, why milk and honey? You think about it, these are 2 of the very, very few foodstuffs that one can obtain without anything, plant or animal, dying. It's quite interesting. Renewable resources. How do you take the land? Holy war. And holy war is not like regular war. There are specific laws that the Bible, injunctions that the Bible lays down to tell people how to engage in a battle being fought on God's behalf. For example, you always bring the troops into battle. This is the modern English, praise the Lord and pass the ammunition. A priest will be there. Indeed, often the Israelites would bring the Holy Ark into battle with them. Officers are required to discharge certain people. For example, if a man has just built a new home, but he hasn't had much occasion to live in it. If he has just planted a vineyard, but has not enjoyed the fruits, literally, of his labor. If he has become engaged, but has not yet gotten married. And of course, the faint-hearted are discharged. So we have the 4F version from the Bible. Ordinances are then made against uncontrolled destruction. For example, the first initiative is that the rulers should be offered terms of a truce. The initiator of the holy war here, Joshua, is to go to the rulers and say, we will come take over your land and put you in forced labor. Do you agree? And if they agree, then that's fine. We wind up with slaves. But if they don't, one can engage in war. But at least there's a possibility of a treaty here. If surrender is denied, all adult males are to be killed. Trees are not to be cut down. This is like the modern SPART bomb. It kills people, but it doesn't kill natural resources. If a woman is taken captive, she is to be allowed 1 month to mourn her dead family members, and this prohibits rape, right? She may then become the soldier's wife. But if he decides he does not like her, he is not permitted to sell her off as a slave or indeed to treat her like a slave. If he takes a woman captive and she becomes his wife, she is legally his wife. She's not some sort of second-order product. Soldiers are required to be ritually pure in the same way they had to be ritually pure when they stood before Mount Sinai, which means they cannot engage in sexual intercourse. And I mention this now because it will become very important when we get to the story of David and Bathsheba. We are told, any town that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, any town in Canaan, you must not let anything that breathes in it remain alive. Total destruction. The irony is, when we actually look at what Joshua does, the first major campaign is the campaign against Jericho. And indeed, surviving Jericho is Rahab the prostitute and her family. So although there is an injunction, destroy everybody, it turns out these injunctions are not necessarily heeded even by characters in the narrative. But these are the general laws, and so the Israelites prepare to enter Canaan under Joshua. Now, if you read the book of Joshua quickly, you don't look at the footnotes and you don't really pay a whole lot of attention, it looks like the book is presenting a blitzkrieg. Joshua and the Israelites get into the land, conquer Jericho, conquer the city of Ai, make it all the way through, and finally at the end they make a covenant renewal ceremony at Shechem. Everything worked perfectly well. There were no glitches. This was the greatest battle program ever enjoined. And in fact, if we've been reading the Bible through, this is what we would have expected. We know the patriarchs had promises that they were going to get the land. Joshua fulfills those promises. Indeed, some biblical scholars have argued that what we have in the biblical text is not a Pentateuch, a 5-book beginning, but rather a Hexateuch, a 6-book beginning, with Joshua showing the fulfillment of the promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Not only does this blitzkrieg model seem to fit with what we would expect to have had happen based on the promises, but one can very cautiously, very cautiously, perhaps match up Joshua's conquests with external historical evidence. It's extremely tentative, but here's how it works. I'm going to go step by step because I have to use math here, and math is not my strong point. Step 1. There's a group of Asiatics. They're called Hyksos. The name actually means rulers of foreign lands. Interesting name for a group. They're from Syria, Palestine, and they move into Egypt around 1720, 1710. That's more or less the time frame for Joseph to have been the Grand Vizier. Perhaps background for Joseph, perhaps not. With the rise of Egypt's 18th dynasty in 1570, the Hyksos are expelled from Egypt. That's step 2. And the native Egyptians take over. That may be the rationale for why Exodus talks about a Pharaoh arose who knew not Joseph, because perhaps this new group of pharaohs are not from the Hyksos ethnic group, and they don't retain the same historical memories. That's step 2. Step 3, according to Exodus 12:40, the time that the people of Israel dwelled in Egypt was 430 years. Step 4, the Pharaoh of the Exodus, if you're confused by now, you can check the booklet. The Pharaoh of the Exodus is traditionally viewed as Ramses II, whose rule began approximately in 1290 BCE. So if you take the time of the arrival of the Hyksos in 1720, and you subtract from it the time of Ramses II's ascension to the throne in 1290, you wind up with 430, and that's the number of years Exodus places the Hebrews in Egypt. It actually matches up. Perhaps then the Hyksos are the background for the story of Joseph, and Ramses II really is the Pharaoh of the Exodus, and the Hebrew people really were enslaved in Egypt. It's possible. And if this is true, then that date would put the conquest of Canaan sometime in the late 13th century, the 1200s. And that actually matches up with archaeology as well. Archaeological investigation in the area of Israel suggests that a good number of cities were destroyed at this particular time. For example, at Bethel, the house of God, where Jacob had his dream of that heavenly ladder, we have archaeological evidence of a violent destruction at the end of the 13th century. Evidence also indicates that cities like Debir and Lachish were destroyed and then only later re-inhabited. Lachish has yielded bowls, clay bowls, with inscriptions mentioning the 4th year of the reign of Merneptah, a pharaoh in Egypt. This is circa 1220, after the so-called time of the conquest. But it does suggest new things are happening. Perhaps people from Egypt came over, could be. In the north, cities like Megiddo and Hazor are also destroyed at the end of the 13th century, and the list goes on. So could it be, in fact, that archaeological evidence proves the story of Joshua? Well, this is biblical studies. Of course, everybody's going to have doubts here or there, and indeed biblical scholars have their doubts about this as well. Israelite attack ruling by Joshua and coming into the community may explain these debris layers, these destruction layers. But a destruction layer is a destruction layer, and unless you have, a sign saying Joshua was here, conquered at such and such a date, it's very difficult to tell what caused the destruction. Intercity warfare, very common in Canaan. The Philistines are now on the scene, coming over the Mediterranean. Perhaps they are involved. A fire could destroy a city-state very easily. Natural problems can happen. Internal revolt, which does happen on occasion. A destruction layer only proves that something has been destroyed. It does not tell us who did the destroying. So we go back to the book of Joshua and we look for confirmation. Was there really a blitzkrieg? But now we read carefully. And it turns out that Joshua, particularly Joshua 1 through 11, the Blitzkrieg section, does not actually tell us that Joshua and company conquered everything. The stories are a little bit problematic. For example, Joshua chapter 7 and 8 describe the conquest of a city called Ai, A-I. It's a great story. The problem is the name Ai already means heap of ruin, which is not the sort of name most people would give to their city. And archaeological investigations suggest that in the 13th century, Ai was already a heap of ruin. It would have been debris, destruction layer when Joshua and company arrived in the first place. What the book of Joshua may well give us is an etiology, a story of origin, explaining why the city is destroyed. And their imagination? Well, of course Joshua did it. But did he actually do it? Archaeological investigation suggests no. And then we have that very famous story of Jericho. When archaeologists engage in their investigation, what they look at is something called a tell. It's an artificial mound created by successive layers of cities that are built and then fall into ruin, and then you build another city on top of that and another city on top of that. And the archaeologist looks at this tell, this artificial mound, as if it's a layer cake. And you can slice through and you can find community destruction layer, different community destruction layer. And people have done this with the tell at Jericho. And what has archaeological investigation yielded? We've got inhabitants at Jericho in the Chalcolithic period, 4000 BCE. This place is already inhabited. And it's inhabited through the Middle Bronze Age. The problem is when we get up to the beginning of the Iron Age, which is when Joshua is starting, that's the one time when there seems to be no evidence of inhabitation. There seemed to be no evidence of inhabitation at all. Now, granted, the tell has suffered severe erosion. Perhaps the evidence that was there has been washed away or blown away, but it remains problematic. Even the story of Jericho remains problematic because this is where we meet Rahab the prostitute. Joshua and company outside the land send in spies to scout out Canaan to
All right, we'll stop there because we don't want to get too far into the book of Joshua, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of an overview about how sometimes the language is used in a form that has multiple meanings. And so every word in Hebrew has a meaning and included in a phrase. And so it's interesting, I find, especially the one that is Ai, which means heap of ruins. So it was already a heap of ruins when they arrived. And we'll have more on this next week when we begin looking at the book of Joshua directly. And we're closing up this overview of the historical books for this week and hope that it will help you to understand the reading as we go and move forward. And that thought, then, here's my suggested reading for you. You could read Psalms 101 and 102 if you like, as it was mentioned in the video earlier, as an introductory to the books of Psalms. But I also suggest you might like to read Psalm 106 because it just in one poem gives you the whole history of Israel. It's like a quick, condensed, concise review of Israel and what happened in their history. And then in preparation for studying the book of Joshua, we'll just read chapter 1 about Joshua's ordination as the ruler, or not ruler, but excuse me, the leader of Israel as they move into the promised land. And I wish you a good week and happy reading and happy spring. As I'm recording this, it's a beautiful sunny day and we've just had showers and the air smells so good. And I just brought to thought this verse to close our lesson. Let us know, let us press on to know the Lord. His appearing is as sure as the dawn. He will come to us like the showers, like the spring rains that water the earth. It's from Hosea chapter 6, verse 3. And a closing prayer. We press on toward the promise of your presence. May we be refreshed by the shower of your goodness, as sure as the spring rain. And I will see you in the next lesson. Happy reading.